Gunnery Sergeant Hartman from Stanley Kubrick's war movie Full Metal Jacket is probably the most famous depiction of a drill sergeant ever put on film. Never blinking, shouting everything he says, and being totally unrelenting in his training of the troops, there isn't a single fictional drill sergeant after 1987 that doesn't owe something to him. To the point that Ermey was able to make an entire career out of basically playing variations of him. But that being said, what most don't pick up on about his character is that he's not supposed to represent everything that a drill sergeant should be, but rather everything that they shouldn't be. And today, I'd like to try and explain why exactly Gunnery Sergeant Hartman isn't somebody that should be admired. And there will be spoilers for both Full Metal Jacket and a few other war movies ahead. So in case there's something you don't want ruined, you should probably keep on the lookout. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so to put it very simply, Gunnery Sergeant Hartman is not an accurate depiction of how drill sergeants really behave, and this has been corroborated by several people in the military, who in particular have noted that sergeants never hit cadets in front of the other troops. Even Ermey himself has gone on record as saying that Hartman was actually a pretty bad sergeant, and considering he himself had a great record as a drill instructor, who would know better than him? But unlike other examples I've covered in other videos, this isn't due to bad writing or taking liberties with reality. Hartman's depiction is very deliberate on Stanley Kubrick's part. Because while it is true that drill sergeants do shout a lot and are often nasty with the cadets, as they have to be prepared for the horrible conditions that they'll face, there's a difference between discipline and abuse. And as anybody with strict parents will unfortunately know, it's very easy for those in charge to blur the lines. And this is important because while discipline teaches people and helps them to follow orders, abuse does not. This is even why drill sergeants are given such strict instructions on what they can and can't do, because if they start abusing the cadets, they'll have a harder time learning the skills required of them and be ill-equipped for the conditions they'll have to deal with, because once again, the goal is to turn them into hardened soldiers that can keep their heads under pressure, obey orders without question, and generally be prepared for anything in a life or death situation. But if abuse comes into the conversation, anxiety and emotional distress starts to set in. And as a result, it's very easy for some to break under the pressure, as the movie even demonstrates. And that's what brings us back to Hartman, because simply put, he's not so much interested in actually preparing his cadets for the horrors of war as he is imposing his power over them and punishing anyone for the slightest offense. In other words, Hartman is a sadist who enjoys disciplining and abusing his cadets way too much, and particularly singles out who he calls Private Pile because he's an easy target. Now, given that he is overweight and shown to not be the most intelligent, a responsible drill sergeant would have him sent to a doctor for further evaluation on whether or not he should be trained. But being the sadistic jerk that he is, Hartman believes that he can turn him into a model soldier through constant abuse and pushing him past his limits. And the reason he's able to get away with this is because he follows the rules just closely enough to hide what he's actually doing. And this is particularly obvious during rifle training, as he's noticeably less strict and more patient with the cadets, since rifle training is considered the most important part of basic training, and therefore when Hartman's superiors are going to be watching him more closely, so he behaves much more in line with how he should be treating them. But in the end, Hartman's methods to turn his men into soldiers are not very effective ones, because contrary to what some might think, and as I already went over, abuse is not encouraged in the military, if only because it makes the soldiers less effective at their jobs. And indeed, the fact that Hartman's training ends with 2 people dead, himself included, should be a pretty big indicator of that fact. Because simply put, the responsibility for Lawrence's breakdown doesn't lie with him, but with Hartman. He never should have been subjected to such harsh treatment and wouldn't have been under normal circumstances. So in the end, it wasn't Pyle who failed Hartman, it was Hartman who failed Pyle. And similarly, we also see in the second half of the movie that while some of the platoon is doing well, they're mostly being overshadowed by other, more efficient cadets, which only further proves that while Hartman superficially resembled the perfect instructor, in actuality his methods were way too cruel and abusive to make his men the ideal soldiers he was aiming for. And because those men were probably trained by instructors who knew the difference between discipline and abuse, they were able to actually turn them into the best, most effective soldiers they could possibly be. Which, of course, is a whole other issue in and of itself, as the movie also demonstrates, but that's not really relevant here. The point is, Hartman is supposed to be an example of a drill instructor that goes way too far, and the fact that he ends up dead at the hands of the man he abused only proves that. Really, there are several examples of fictional drill instructors that are a much better representation of what a sergeant should actually look like, but one of the best is ironically from the Bill Murray comedy Stripes. Because while on the whole the military is portrayed as being full of buffoons, there is one character that's played more or less straight, with that being Drill Sergeant Hulka. And indeed, we see that he's a man of discipline who also doesn't hesitate to pick on cadets that get on his nerves, but is also way more reasonable than Hartman. He never abuses the cadets, only disciplines them when they've broken the rules, only targets individuals who show him resistance, but never abuses them, and only disciplines his men according to regulations. And in addition to that, he's also shown to heavily practice what he preaches. He genuinely believes in things like honor, courage, discipline, and patriotism, and is willing to back up any order he makes with action on his part. To put it simply, unlike Hartman, who wants his men to follow his every command simply because he's in charge, Hulka actually wants his men to respect him and what he represents, which is why he always does everything by the book, because he believes in the value of that book. So while certain aspects of his character are obviously exaggerated or downplayed because it's a comedy, on the whole, Sergeant Hulka is still a great representation of what an actual drill instructor should look like, as I further explained in another video, which you can find a link in the description to. Because he not only believes in what he's doing, but he knows the difference between abuse and discipline, and never mixes the two up. So hopefully all of this has helped demonstrate why Gunnery Sergeant Hartman is supposed to be the villain of the first half of Full Metal Jacket. Because if he were just an instructor doing his job like Sergeant Hulka, things would have turned out a lot better for him. But instead, he's a man who abuses his position of power to satisfy his sadism in the guise of preparing his cadets for even worse horrors. And again, considering that gets him killed in the end, you'd think more people would pick up on the fact that he's supposed to be seen as in the wrong and way too harsh on everyone, but especially poor Pyle. Though given the general reputation drill sergeants have, it is easy to see how many might mistake his abuse for normal sergeant behavior and assume that Pyle just couldn't handle the pressure, especially because Hartman heavily influenced the stereotype in the first place. But in the end, none of that changes the fact that Gunnery Sergeant Hartman was in reality a pretty bad drill instructor and did way more harm than good in preparing his cadets for what they would face later on. Okay, I think that ends this video. So now it's your turn to tell me. Do you believe that, contrary to what many view him as, Gunnery Sergeant Hartman wasn't a very good drill instructor? Or do you believe he was a lot better at his job than I'm giving him credit for? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that you don't have to agree with the more opinion-based parts of this video if you don't want to. You can feel about Gunnery Sergeant Hartman and his effectiveness as a drill instructor any way you'd like, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.